This is help for the Physiological Section C 12 marker, which is discussing the strengths and weaknesses of a physiological approach using examples from any physiological studies. Again, a few people were struggling, particularly on the weaknesses for this one, so I thought I'd just do a quick video and then hopefully understand it better. So the first strength of the approach is that it's very scientific because it uses measures which are objective. They're kind of things that don't require any subjective interpretation, which suggests that what they say about behaviour is more likely to be valid, true, and reliable, consistent each time it's tested. So, for example, let's go with Maguire. So, in Maguire's study, they use an MRI scanner. So, they had MRI scans of the taxi drivers and non-taxi drivers hippocampi. And they also had a blind researcher who didn't know anything about the study, didn't know that the scans they were looking at were either taxi drivers or non-taxi drivers, and they didn't know the results from the voxel-based morphometry, which looks at the area of the hippocampi. So they didn't know anything about it, and they were just doing the job. They were just pixel counting the MRI scans of the hippocampi, and also the voxel-based morphometry is done by computer, so again, very objective. There's no real subjective interpretation there. There's nobody kind of being influenced by their thoughts, feelings and opinions when they're interpreting the data. So what that suggests is that anything that is found from this approach is more likely to be valid. Similarly, you could have used event and climate as evidence for this point. You could have said that they use an EEG and they had electrodes, so for example they were placed by the eyes, so things like the eye movements and what direction they were going in for that third hypothesis of whether or not eye movements related to dream content. That was objective. There was a sensor, an electrode that was saying whether the eyes had moved or not. It wasn't somebody looking at them. There's less scope for error. There's less chance of human error in these studies. So what that means is that if an approach has studies which are valid, are true, and consistent, so every time that they're done we get the same results, then it's kind of a good explanation for behaviour. So it suggests that the physiological approach is really good because it's scientific and because it's objective. It's not influenced by any subjective interpretation, so its way of explaining behaviour is going to be more valid. However, on the plus side of having them very scientific and objective, the negative of that is that they're often conducted in laboratories. So that means that the studies themselves lack ecological validity, which means that if the approach is basing all its kind of theories on studies which are in a laboratory experiment, it can explain behaviour in a lab validly and reliably, accurately and consistently, but it can't really apply that to everyday life. So for example, in event and climate, the electrodes being attached to somebody's scalp and face, being connected to an EEG machine, sleeping in a sleep lab, means that the way they dream and the way they experience REM sleep might be completely different to what it's like in the real world because they're under such unnatural conditions, which means that any results that they get in that lab about dreaming being associated with REM sleep might not actually be true in real life. So the approach itself is quite limited. It can explain behaviour in a lab very well, very accurately and reliably, but can it actually say that that's exactly the way people behave in real life? Perhaps not. So for that reason, the approach is limited for explaining behaviour in the real world. It can only really explain behaviour in a lab. The approach is good because it's got practical applications. They've all got practical applications, so they're all good for that reason. I'd probably get rid of where it says nature-nurture debate because the studies of this approach are very difficult to explain why they support nature-nurture debate, so just get rid of that. Just say it's got practical application because it's useful. It can be used in an everyday setting to benefit society. So for example, Sperry's study. Sperry showed that if you presented a question mark to the left visual field, that people with split brain would have difficulty naming it. And the reason for that is because anything in their left visual field is processed by the right hemisphere. And the right hemisphere doesn't contain language, so they can't say it. So they have difficulty trying to say whatever is in their left visual field. So what that suggests is that you can rehabilitate people with split brain. You can say, that if you're having difficulty naming something, then perhaps, move your head so that the visual fields cross over so that it can be processed also by the right visual field. So we can use this study to help us. It's also got uses because it tells us a lot about lateralization of functioning. It tells us, what the left side of the brain does, what the right side of the brain does, um, and how that can be developed. Similarly, if we've got Maguire study, if we know that lots of experience helps you be better at tasks. So, for example, lots of navigational experience means that your hippocampi changes shape, you can change the structure of your brain so that you're better at that task. Then, things like brain training programs can be developed so that the more you do a particular task, so for example, the more you play an instrument, your brain will change shape and you'll get better at that instrument. Anything like that, even kind of like running. If you get really good at running, then do loads of it, and then your brain will re-specialise, and then, maybe perhaps the balance area of your brain will get better, and you get better at running as a whole, and so therefore, we've got practical applications. The real world use of the research from this study that it tells us, because before these studies we didn't know that these things happen, we didn't know that the brain changed shape and that's what made you get better at something. So it allows us to know that if you continue to have the determination to do a task, your brain will change shape and you will get better at that task. So it's got a real world application, which means that this approach is really, really useful for that reason. The final weakness, like all approaches, is reductionist. It's only taking into account biological influences on behaviour. It's saying that, your behaviour is caused by your brain structure in Maguire and Sperry, and by kind of electrical impulses in the brain and dependent climate. So you can use any of the studies and say, well, it's quite difficult actually to say, because for Sperry the difficulties do come from the split brain. It is a brain structure thing. It's not really because of anything else. It's not really because of thoughts and unconscious conflicts or anything like that. So you can't really use Sperry. The same for Maguire. Maguire is difficult because you're suggesting that spatial navigational experience is because of the brain structure, but the brain structure is caused by spatial navigation. So again, it's a complicated one. You can't really isolate out whether it's nature or nurture because it's a correlation and not a cause and effect study. So the best one to go with for this point is dependent climate. You might suggest that dependent climate is suggesting that dreaming occurs during REM. REM is a physical thing because it's eye movements, and it's because you've got a similar brain pattern to when you're awake. So there's lots of electrical activation of the brain when we're asleep, but during REM. And so that suggests that it's a physiological explanation for why people are dreaming because of that increased activation during REM. However, it could actually be because of something different. So, for example, it could be because of the psychodynamic perspective explanation that dreaming is because of unconscious conflicts. The cognitive would say that it's because you're trying to restructure information that you've learned in the day into different kind of schemas in your mind, different categories for different bits of information. So there's lots of different explanations for dreaming, and therefore, the approach is quite reductionist, saying that it's just a physiological experience, it's just brain activation and nothing else. So for that reason, the approach is quite limited. So essentially what you're doing is you're giving your point, which is what we've got on this slide here. You're giving some evidence from the study which supports that point, because what you're saying about that point might not be true, so we need some evidence which shows that it's true, and then a further explanation of why that is a strength and weakness of the approach itself. So trying to get away from just the study, because if you say the strength and weakness of the study, you're going to get no marks. It's got to be specifically about the physiological approach itself. So it's bringing it back to answering the question by explaining, okay, this is a strength of the approach because this is a weakness of the approach because. If you do that final point, then you show an exam that you understand the question and that you've answered it correct. Hopefully that helps, and you can do that question now.